welcome everyone. I'm glad you could make it on such a cold and rainy evening amid all of your other work. So I'll begin by making the land acknowledgement that we are meeting on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. These land acknowledgements are very important for those of us who are opposed to settler colonialism everywhere in the world. And so it has a special meaning for this event, which is about land rights of the Palestinians. And there's much to be said about it, but I won't say it. Instead, I'll just refer you to an article that's written by one of our speakers, Brenna Bandar, just published last year, called A Land Acknowledgement in a Different Key, Palestine Solidarity and the Disruption of the Liberal Script and Middle East Critique, 2024. Okay, that will be a great read explores this idea of the meaning of a land acknowledgement. So just a couple preliminary comments that no recording is allowed. It is being recorded here, and this recording will be made available later. Okay. Also, this is there's always a chance that there's an agent provocateur here, and if there is, just stay calm, don't take the bait. I think all of you know the routine by now, but just a reminder. This is an event that's been organized by the UBC Faculty for Palestine. I'm a member of it. My name is John Rosa. Just because I'm moderating it doesn't mean I have any leadership in it. I'm just one member amongst many other members. There's about 100 members in the organization, and you can find our statement of principles on our website. So it's been over 2 years since the genocide in Gaza began. And we can see that the genocide hasn't ended with this so-called ceasefire that began about 6 weeks ago. And so UBC Faculty for Palestine felt that it was time for an update on the events in Palestine and other neighboring countries under attack, and that it was also time for a discussion about where we're at now with the boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign. So we're fortunate that we have here at UBC 3 experts on these matters. These are professors with long experience in thinking about and publishing on the struggles of the Palestinian people. We're also fortunate that one of the founders of the international boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, Omar Barghouti, has agreed to record a message for this teach-in, and that will be played. It's about a 15-minute video that we'll watch once the speakers are done. It was recorded, I think, just yesterday from occupied Palestine. So each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll listen to the recording of Omar Barghouti, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for question and answer. Okay? So let's begin. Our first speaker is Jasbir Puar, who is a professor at the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. And she will be speaking on genocide as perpetual maiming.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all here. Thanks for coming tonight. I work on critical disability studies, so my goal this evening is to try to get us to think a little bit more about genocide, not just as a practice of extermination and killing, but also a practice of perpetual maiming, debilitation, the production of slow death. These are all features of what Patrick Wolf called structural genocide. Fred Moten calls this genocide is regulation unto the vanishing point of extermination. And genocide in the end is just this continual maiming, which moves in this non-space between killing each and every one and the constantly cultivated, measured, and tested inability to kill all. So what I'm starting with is basically the understanding that genocide is not only about killing, it is also, and perhaps more profoundly, about forcing people to live a certain kind of life. The 1984 International Genocide Convention defines genocide as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And it also states that genocide is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And so there is a kind of mention and a focus on the calculated conditions of life, right, that would bring about physical destruction. To me, that signals a kind of titration-driven biopolitics that induces necropolitics. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean about that, but I think we can think of the 17-year siege as created by this kind of calculated conditions of life. I think it's difficult to apprehend genocide not only as a politics of extermination, but also as a politics of living in negation. But doing so helps us to attend not only to the massive scale of annihilation, but also the kind of minutiae of deprivation that conditions life. Mainstream discourses of genocide remain tethered to the spectacle of mass death, and circumscribed by eventness. So even we kind of already have this language of the genocide is over, even though we know it's not, right? This is a kind of legalistic model of genocide. It privileges the threshold of mass killing, but at the same time erases the technologies of injury and abandonment that precede it. And there's a focus on event as crisis over and above these durational structures of inequality and oppression. And so what's really interesting is despite the Genocide Convention's broad scope, which actually codifies the intent to destroy a people, but it does not require that the destruction be fast or spectacular or even final, legal and political interpretations have conveniently focused on intentional mass killing, which allows states to avoid a definitional range that could be applied to their own practices of slow violence, of organized abandonment, and debilitation. So this kind of delimitation of what genocide is kind of popularly understood to be is very convenient for all settler colonial states and other states kind of enacting various forms of violence upon their populations. I'm just going to go through a really kind of terse genealogy of what I call the right to maim in Palestine. December 9th, 1987 was the start of the first Palestinian Intifada. It lasted nearly 6 years. Yitzhak Rabin was the Israeli defense minister at the time. And he decided that Israeli soldiers, in the face of this massive scale and scope of the uprisings of the First Intifada, would use, quote, force, might, and beatings to extinguish Palestinian resistance. So on the 26th of February, 1988, 4 Israeli soldiers bludgeoned 2 Palestinian teenagers in the hills of the West Bank with rocks, and a CBS camera person caught the beatings on tape, and shortly thereafter the world was witness to this leaked footage and what became known as Rabin's infamous break their bones policy. The break their bones policy understood that bone breaker Rabin sought to increase the number of wounded, but not to kill them. It was imperative not to attract international attention with high death tolls. It was imperative not to solicit empathy for Palestinians, to gestate any kinds of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. And he also, and this was also common discourse, claimed that this was a humane manner of containing the uprisings. In this logic, injury is then rationalized as the use of minimal force and granted impunity. And in the name of this kind of ever-growing complex of humanitarianism, the belief that injuring is not as harmful as killing actually authorizes the expansion of violence and the expansion of its acceptance. During the Second Intifada, something similar happened. The prime minister at the time, Ehud Barak, was explicit that high casualties damage Israel's reputation. The policy of shooting to inflict harm continued. Knees were a favored target. Bullets were used that specifically were designed to severely injure, and the goal was to neutralize, but not to kill. There were 4 military offensives on the Gaza Strip from 2006 to 2014 that left at least 17,000 Gazan Palestinians injured, and the most notable increase of injuries occurs during the summer of 2014, which at that time represented more than 5 times the number of killed. Across the history of bombardments of Gaza, we have a deepening of debilitation, and we have the kind of accumulation after each Israeli military bombardment of the numbers of people with permanent disability. So in each of these cases, maiming has a tactical value. During the first and second intifadas, it functioned to deflect international attention while licensing greater destruction of bodies. In the case of Gaza, the injured disappear amidst the dry statistics of death. So in 2014, during that 53-day bombardment, we understood the death toll every day, but we were not as attuned to the 11,000 plus people who were injured and more than 1,000 Palestinians who were disabled in 2014. Injury has been constituted as incidental, implies that wounds will heal, and this is an assumption that fails to apprehend the dearth of treatment options in Gaza's increasingly decimated medical infrastructure. Just a reminder of something that in 2012, Gaza was declared that it would be unlivable by 2020, right? So just a reminder that we already have the production of genocidal life going on during the siege in a very active way. There's a form of logistical governance as warfare, what Ghassan Abu Sitta calls the titration of life, erratically making available, then withholding clean water, steady electricity, medical supplies, medicine, basic daily needs, foods, calories even. There's a kind of bureaucratic sadism with the unpredictable restriction to movement, the cyclical destruction of life-sustaining infrastructures, the prevention of meaningful reconstruction. And so by 2020, said the UN, Gaza would be unlivable, in essence setting the conditions already of extreme deprivation for the current iteration of genocide to unfold. This would be what I mean about the conditions of life, this titration-driven biopolitics that induces necropolitics. The notion of livability, therefore, is invoked less as a humanistic measure and more as a cruel pronouncement of the uneven demands to survive forces of exploitation and disposability. So there's a creation of a chronic debilitation of a population that becomes heavily reliant on healthcare to survive, and then the gradual erosion of health, slow death, and the wearing down of the population. The Great March of Return marks a kind of pivotal moment in the visual and ideological grammar of Israeli violence. I think this was a brazen shift in Israel's deployment of the right to maim. It's also a moment when Israel is testing out how much impunity it has to do whatever it wants to do. And it becomes, I think, a time when there's a kind of clearing the ground for escalations of future violence. So the Israeli military shot over 30,000 protesters and injured, and to injure them, 7,000 were shot in the knees and lower limbs. And this resulted in hundreds of amputations and propelled Gaza into what medical practitioners deemed an amputation crisis. So this is even before in 2019, right? What we have during the Great March of Return is there's no longer an attempt to avoid any glare of international disapproval. The injuries were not incidental or accidental, they were calculated. The Israeli army confirmed this tactic of aiming below the knee explicitly. The Israeli Supreme Court approved this tactic. And unlike the break their bones policy of the first Intifada, these injuries were public, they were photographed, they circulated with impunity, they were printed all over mainstream newspapers, and they had an undeniable ideological intent. they were attempting to work to acculturate the quote-unquote international community to accept Palestinian bodies as damaged. And this spectacle, of course, shifts the global attention from the vibrancy and epic magnitude of these nonviolent protests in a liberation movement to the medical needs of an afflicted population. So we have a humanitarian crisis takes over what is the kind of political uprising, mass political uprising. I would argue that this transformation of the Palestinian into the maimed, trying to create a signature injury of settler colonial rule, was ideological preparation for the next phase of genocide. The world was tutored into seeing Palestinian bodies as always already marked for dismemberment. And in this sense, maiming was not only military strategy, it was a kind of aesthetic pedagogy. If you track newspapers in Israel around that time, they have testimony from Israeli soldiers saying that it was their job to report every day at the end of the day how many knees they had targeted and successfully shot at. The current iteration of genocide does not require this veneer of humanitarianism. It no longer solicits liberal consensus nor acquiescence. It has, through its past violence, tested and created the conditions for its impunity of its activities. And I would say that maiming here then is no longer a covert form of harm, rather an outcome second best to killing, a kind of residual of killing. South African advocate Tembeka Nagu Kaitobi testified before the International Court of Justice in January of 2024. He said, Israel now operates with explicit orders to destroy and to maim what cannot be destroyed. So maiming now becomes not a kind of supplementary relation to the right to kill, but both are explicitly enacted as strategies of violent decimation. And I think the pager attacks in Lebanon are quite a clear example of this, and I think that Hisham will talk more about this, but you have 4,000 people disfigured in one instance from these pager attacks. The ammunition in these pagers were enough to disfigure, but not enough to kill. So this was very much so a calculated maiming, mass maiming event. And then the next day, or within several days, there are horrific attacks on southern Lebanon and Beirut that killed thousands of people. So you can see here this kind of right to maim and right to kill working in tandem. There's been a lot of attention about amputations, and I do want to say a few things about that, about amputation. I think these are probably the most kind of visible and spectacleized of injury that we've seen. But there is a kind of pandemic of disability that's happening in Gaza right now. There are 173,000 people injured. More than 40,000 of them will live with permanent disabilities. So this is almost doubling Gazans' disabled population. Rehabilitation centers are destroyed, so amputees have few services. A lot of them have had to make their own prostheses. There's no lump. There's a lack of stump care. Deaf Gazans that have now had a hand or arm amputated can no longer, have lost their ability to sign, to speak, to use sign language. 35,000 people now have significant hearing damage due to explosions. Assistive devices were destroyed, wheelchairs, crutches, hearing aids. Disabled people moved rapidly without accessible transport or mobility devices across rubble. Evacuation becomes impossible for many. People are often separated from their caretakers. We know that kind of dialysis, chemotherapy, physiotherapy, reproductive care services are all disrupted, if not gone. Insulin unavailable, starvation and malnutrition have long-term systemic effects, and on and on and on. So in essence, I would say there's a kind of mass subjection to premature death. I did want to end on a kind of thinking about what Palestinians in Gaza are doing in response to all of this. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, who performed many of these amputations, and now the amputation population is at least 5 times what it was before this iteration of genocide, so that actually kind of dramatically changes the visible landscape of the social. But he describes the process by which these severed limbs are honored and mourned. They were placed in small boxes, marked with the name and body part, and then buried. Not all of the amputated children were old enough to know or speak their names. And so he argues that this is far from a minor gesture. This is an act of entombing limbs whereby maiming is not normalized but ritually resisted. And in Abu Sitta's words, an amputated limb must become a badge of honor, a visible sign of Palestinian endurance and a refusal to disappear, not the mark of a disabled life as lack, but of a life lived in radical defiance of colonial ontology. And so in essence, to vehemently reject Israel's attempt at inscribing a signature injury. And I just wanted to end with just some questions that all of this kind of makes me think about in terms of our own organizing. How can we be more attentive to disability and debilitation and our solidarity organizing, including making our events more accessible? Why do so many of our forums on healthcare and the destruction of healthcare infrastructure make no mention or very little mention of disability, even though everything being described is the result of mass disabling violence of the genocide? At the same time, the language describing the experiences of bodily states in Gaza foregrounds a completely different terminology, the terminology of dismemberment, of woundedness, of mutilation, emaciation, torn and burnt flesh, suggesting that this category disability that we might use quite freely here cannot at all adequately describe what is happening. And then my last question, so in this context, what are the uses but also the limits of a disability justice approach to the genocide in Gaza for the purposes of our own organizing? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaspia. Our next speaker is Hisham Safiuddin, who is the Associate Professor in the History Department and the Canada Research Chair in the History of the Modern Middle East. He writes frequently for Middle East Eye about current political affairs in the Middle East, and he also writes for the Middle East Research and Information Project, or MERIP, which is a vital resource for well-informed analyses, as it has been for decades. So I'd recommend consulting his articles there. I won't list all of his publications, just wanted to mention some of the articles that you can easily access online about current events. All right, take it away, Hisham.
Thank you, very much. I appreciate it. Good evening. And I was just to build on the last point you made about the badge of honor, as you spoke about all these different ways in which Israel is trying to inscribe this image of the victim Palestinian, as abhorrent, as painful, and as monstrous as it is. You know, in the first Intifada, while we had the broken bones, we also had the children with the stones throwing, standing in front of tanks. With the marches, we had people actually braving and going all the way to the borderline and standing in the face of Israeli aggression. Even with October 7, Israel today is trying to bury the very idea of resistance by claiming that any resistance is futile, which is not. So despite all this effort to erase the Palestinians, I'm always again inspired by the fact that the Palestinians are here and they're here to stay. And in my view, of course, they are here to stay well beyond the life of the State of Israel. The title of my talk is Zionism Unleashed, Expansionism and Ethnic Cleansing. I should have wrote Beyond Palestine. The last fall, Israel launched a brutal and bloody war on Lebanon with devastating consequences. In a little over a year, As also has been mentioned, Israel has attacked and killed more than 4,000 people, including more than 300 children, and injured 17,000 more. More than 1 million people were displaced in this war in Lebanon. Israel terror tactics ranged from aerial carpet bombing of residential neighborhoods to a ground invasion that left a trail of death and destruction, to the indiscriminate detonation of handheld pagers in public spaces like supermarkets, hospitals, and bedrooms, killing and leaving others with extinguished eyesight or amputated fingers or disfigured faces. This is one of the victims, but still standing high and holding their victory sign. On November 27, 2024, a cessation of hostilities agreement was signed. But again and again, since the ceasefire agreement, Israel's war has continued by other means, or same means but less intensity. So despite the full cessation of operations by Hezbollah, Israeli drone surveillance and attacks, as well as occasional artillery shelling and air raids, are a near daily occurrence. In fact, Israel has later bombed and killed pager attack victims who had survived the first series of explosions. And some of these people are coming out and actually inspiring and resistance, and that's part of why Israel is doing this. And I think here I'm showing the fact that Netanyahu gave Trump a golden pager. Again, a very expression of the fascism that we live in today, where you can actually brag about one of the most heinous acts of terrorism. The Israeli forces that actually tried to invade Lebanon but failed to run deep because of resistance, because of armed resistance, they still nevertheless occupy several hilltops inside Lebanese territory that straddle the entirety of the border. These are some of the points. This is in Arabic. I couldn't find an equivalent in English, but the red dots all across the border is where these new areas of occupied Lebanese territory exist. Now, if you follow the media, a lot of the media coverage that you might be following is obsessed with this question of disarming Hezbollah. But I would argue this is somewhat of a distraction from the grave situation in South Lebanon. The people of South Lebanon, thanks to Israeli actions, are actually facing what I would argue is a clear case of ethnic cleansing. And I do not use these terms polemically or lightly. Current facts on the ground point in that direction, and I'm trying to make the case here for it. Firstly, recent reports by international humanitarian groups and human rights agencies have exposed the extent of the systematic and wanton destruction that Israel's military has inflicted on southern Lebanon's frontier region since last year's escalation began. The reports point out to worrying trends of forced displacement and dispossession, which are hard to justify from a purely military point of view. This is not my analysis, it's the analysis of these groups, including, I'm going to mention, Doctors Without Borders and, more importantly, Amnesty. So according to Doctors Without Borders, frequent Israeli attacks since the agreement, so not during the war, after the so-called end of the war, have prevented the return of more than 82,000 displaced residents. Many of the hospitals and primary care facilities that were damaged by Israeli attacks during the war remain closed, and some require rehabilitation. At least 57 people have been killed while trying to return to their homes, and we know that the question of return is key to ethnic cleansing, to the so-called success of ethnic cleansing. It's not simply displacing people, it's making sure they don't return. In fact, Israel has officially declared that anyone who moves south of a line that is roughly parallel to the border, running between 3 and 11 kilometers deep, quote unquote, puts themselves in danger. I was going to play a video, but I'll spare you and I'll just read. Satellite imagery and media footage that is analyzed by Amnesty International reveals that between October 1, 2024 and 26th of January 2025, so basically in the 4 months period, Israel destroyed more than 10,000 structures, including places of worship, agricultural land, and even a football field in one of the villages. In several municipalities, the damage was near total, affecting around 70% of all structures. Most of these sites were attacked after not before the end of active combat, with manually laid explosives and bulldozers. They had 60 days to withdraw. They used that period to destroy whatever they could, to detonate and blow up entire villages. If I were to show you some images, literally very similar to some of the footage we see from Gaza, was actually happening in South Lebanon. And as a matter of fact, Amnesty found no proof of the presence of Hezbollah fighters at the time of detonation. Instead, the video evidence shows that Israelis were reveling in the destruction and reciting hateful slogans like "May your village burn," which we've heard some of this maybe elsewhere. This behavior is very similar again to what we have seen and is often associated with either ethnic cleansing or genocidal intent, as is the case. So these developments, in fact, confirm reports that Israel is insisting that several border villages remain depopulated as part of the so-called buffer zone. Now, the fears of ethnic cleansing of southern Lebanon are not merely founded on present realities and future risks, but on past legacies, including the tragic story of the so-called 7 lost villages. In 1923, Anglo-French agreement demarcated the borders between the newly created Greater Lebanon and Mandatory Palestine, and reassigned 7 villages that were originally considered Lebanese to the British mandate. Now, for centuries prior, these villages, like other villages straddling modern-day Lebanon and occupied northern Palestine, have existed as part of undivided Ottoman realm. In 1948, the 7 villages shared the fate of other Palestinian villages. They were ethnically cleansed by Zionist militias, with most of their inhabitants expelled into Lebanon. The names of these villages were replaced by the names of the newly established Jewish settlements. Many of the survivors of these villages today are deprived of their Lebanese papers, and at the same time, they're not recognized as Palestinian refugees because they were somehow gotten their Lebanese citizenship under French rule, and now they are back in Lebanon, but they're seen by the Lebanese state as Palestinian and by UNRWA as Lebanese. So they're in the state of, some of them acquired citizenship, but many are in a state of limbo. So this is about, again, we go back to the colonial origins. The facts on the ground that we see today are in line. They're not the exception. They're not simply something that's new, with the long-standing Zionist colonial ambitions and policies dating back more than a century. For the early Zionists, settling Palestine meant settling the largest possible territory that vaguely overlapped with a biblical vision of a holy land. Maps presented by the World Zionist Organization, as the one shown here, to the Paris Conference in 1919, clearly show that Zionists sought to include in their territory southern Lebanon, including the Litani River and up to the coastal city of Saida, an estimated 60 kilometers from the current border. Zionists, like all European settlers, were also keen to secure the most fertile land and freshwater resources. Eastern boundaries of the proposed map included large swathes of Syrian and Jordanian territory that fully engulfed Lake Tabaraya and the Jordan River. It was French counter-proposals that prevented this area from being incorporated into British Mandatory Palestine. So these are the areas, I'm just using the cursor here. This is part of southern Lebanon that was under this plan supposed to become part of Mandatory Palestine. This is part of the Golan Heights. This is part of Jordan. And this is part of Sinai. This is all proposed all the way back in 1919. Initial ambitions to colonize southern Lebanon were shelved after the partition plan and the balance of power that created the current borders we know. But they were never extinguished. During this latest war, Michael Freund, who previously served as Deputy Communications Director for Israeli Prime Minister, and Benjamin Netanyahu, and I have wanted war criminal before it, but I skipped that, but we all know he is, claimed that, open quote, historically speaking, southern Lebanon is in fact northern Israel. According to Freud, the book of Joshua promised Sidon, or Lebanon's modern-day city of Saida, to the Jewish people. Freud also listed several shrines in the south as Jewish and evidence of the right to the land. Freud, by the way, was born in the US. We know, of course, this is one of the things we have to confront. is this conflation between, of course, the existence of indigenous Muslim, Arab, and Muslim, Jewish, and Christian populations, and this idea that this history, which all these three religions share, is a justification for settler colonialism. Somehow, it's the exclusive right that a certain population has over this territory, and the use of this biblical history, when in fact, if you look at concrete plans of colonization, quite often the concrete plan referred to the actual land of Palestine, whereas the imagined Zionist settler state referred to the idea of an Israel. So, despite all of this, we see resistance always, people's resistance always, insisting on pushing back. And in January of 2005, despite all the destruction that has happened, thousands of Lebanese defied Israeli orders not to return to their villages. They marched back and entered their villages without any support, not from the Lebanese army, not from any other, no protection, without protection. And actually 23 people died by Israeli fire on that day. Civilians, they were just with their own bodies going back to their villages and insisting on going back. And since then, there have been numerous initiatives that have been launched to set up makeshift schools, to rebuild village squares and houses of worship, and to resuscitate agricultural production. But a return to normalcy is still far off. Without security and the restoration of some military deterrence, the threat of long-term displacement is rising. I can tell you from eyewitness accounts, I personally can't go to my village except during the day. If I stay there, I could be bombed. Makeshift homes, they will bomb them. They will constantly have the drones over your head. You literally actually cannot stay there unless you are willing to risk your own life. And it's still happening on a daily basis. Now, another concept is this idea of arming the oppressor and disarming the oppressed. I want to talk about this because the idea of leaving defenseless people and actually demanding that defenseless people not even have the basic means of defending themselves in the front of this powerful state. So, tens of thousands of UN troops are stationed in South Lebanon. We have almost 10,000 Lebanese army troops right now, but they have still failed to protect the people of the South. And the Lebanese army is beholden to US influence and funding, and so it will never be equipped to defend Lebanon from Israeli aggression because Israel is an ally of the United States. And actually, the US envoy and ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barak, 2 minutes, who is also an accused pedophile, said that it's not possible to provide, they're only providing detonation and discharges to the Lebanese army so they can blow up, weapon caches instead of actually having weapons to defend Lebanese against the Israelis. So I'm going to wrap up by maybe introducing a few main points. If we zoom out, we are facing today a Zionist supremacist logic. We are facing, in the case of Syria, Syria was not involved in the war, did not launch attacks against Israel. The new regime is actually trying to reach out to the Americans, have consistently said they're willing to actually potentially sign a deal with the Israelis. And even then, the Israelis launched hundreds of attacks to demilitarize and destroy Syria. And they've occupied now this purple area. So they've already occupied the Golan Heights in the past. Now they've occupied more territory. They're also harassing the people of the hinterland of Quneitra, the region in Syria, to prevent them from coming back. If we go to Gaza, we also see the creation of the so-called Yellow Line. This is another land grab on top of the, actual measures being taken and described of continuing the genocide. So this is another aspect. Expansionism today is about territorial grabs plus the partition and division of the countries around Israel in order to create sectarian cantons like the region of Suwaida in South Syria, which is the mirror image of expansionism. So even if Israel doesn't expand, it's creating these cantons so that it actually can maintain its supremacy. So under the status quo today, any talk of so-called, I'll wrap up, this is my last slide, any talk of peace is naive at best, as much as all of us would also, of course, want peace. or sinister doublespeak at worst. If peace has any chance, it is only when justice is served. It is only when this Zionist supremacist project that has been causing so much suffering for a century is dismantled and Palestine is liberated. It is when we end colonialism, racism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, dispossession, and dehumanization. And some dare call this anti-Semitism. Condemn us, it doesn't matter, history will absolve us. Humanity is a crossroads. We either accept this new fascist world order, which has other implications in other parts of the world I haven't spoken about, or we rebel together against it. The struggle for Palestine is at the crosshairs of this fight to defend human dignity and freedom. The struggle continues. Thank you.
So I was told that this in Latin means let justice be done or the heavens fall. And the heavens feel like they're falling because of all of this injustice. Our last speaker, who's with us here in the room, is Professor Brenna Bandar, who's a professor of law here at UBC. And she will be speaking about international law, land rights, reconstruction plans. And I'm not going to, again, go through all your publications. You can see them online on her faculty page.
Okay, thank you very much. It's always difficult to follow Jasbir and Hisham. I want to say it's great to see so many people here. I never thought I would see this many kafia in the law faculty. And I also want to say it's great to see so many law students here. It's just, it's great. So maybe we can take the holding of this event here and the fact that there are so many law students here as a sign of a little bit of a shift, which is important to note, I think. Okay, my presentation is going to be quite different than the ones that you've heard. I'm just trying to provide some updates on some of the legal developments over the last little while. And I'm going to end on something very concrete in terms of action points. So that's before we hear from Omar Barghouti by video. Okay, so just very briefly, there was an ICJ judgment from July 2024 that is quite important, not because international law is being enforced in a meaningful way, and as we know, after several provisional measures rulings in relation to the genocide case brought by South Africa against Israel, is stopping the violence. But the reason why I think law and these ICJ judgments remain important is because of the effect that they can have on our political discourse and our organizing. So that's why I'm bothering to talk about these judgments. So in the ICJ judgment of July 2024, which was actually lodged years before the genocide began in 2023, involved not the genocide, but the legality of Israel's occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories. And the court found that the extension of Israeli sovereignty over the OPT violates international law. So the quote there, the sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the OPT and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israel's presence in the OPT unlawful. Now, the judgment is supported by highly detailed evidence of punitive house demolitions, the extraction of water, minerals, and other resources for the sole benefit of the Israeli Jewish population, the forced transfer of Palestinians and the dispossession of their land, and restrictions on movement. The court added that Israel's legislation and measures in the OPT violate the international prohibition on racial segregation and apartheid. The ICJ mandated Israel to end its occupation, dismantle its settlements, provide full reparations to Palestinian victims, and facilitate the return of displaced people. So, a legal win, right? I want to just briefly talk, however, about the limits of the ICJ ruling on occupation. This is a point that has been made by Palestinian legal scholars and others for decades, so there's nothing new in what I'm saying, but it's still important to reiterate. Because the ruling on the illegality of the occupation was taken forward on the basis of the laws of occupation pertaining to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, it occludes our view of seeing what is happening in historic Palestine as a whole. So under international law, settler colonialism is non-justiciable. It is not a crime. In 1960, colonization was deemed a crime, a violation of international law, but that did not include settler colonialism. And so, as we can see in this quote from Darrell Lee, for over 40 years, 10 million people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea have lived under a single segregated political regime, the State of Israel. Occupation law is not merely an inadequate tool for analyzing this regime, it can also help legitimize the very spatial arrangements upon which it depends. So this is a really important fact that we need to consider when we are, doing our advocacy, and also just in terms of really trying to understand what's happening on the ground. Another way in which that legal victory is limited is the fact that, as a recently issued report from Adala, post-7 October, a new wave of anti-Palestinian Israeli laws, the Knesset continues to advance a wide range of laws that intensify racial apartheid control and repression of all Palestinians living under Israeli control. So the judgment from July 2024, of course, did not address beyond East Jerusalem the situation of apartheid that Palestinians with Israeli citizenship have to face on a day-to-day basis. Okay. So as we've already heard from multiple different perspectives, we are facing, despite 3 provisional measures rulings pertaining to the genocide by the ICJ, right? So there were provisional measures rulings in January 2024, March 2024, and May 2024. And the one that came down from the ICJ in May 2024 actually did say specifically, unlike the other 2, that Israel had to stop. It had to cease fire. It had to stop its military action in Rafah. And of course, these have all been roundly ignored. So despite these rulings, Israel continues to commit genocide with impunity. And this quotation from Yara Hawari, I think, tells us how what we are seeing is not a ceasefire, but a continuation of the genocide under diplomatic cover. And I think that, in fact, saying that Israel has violated the ceasefire 500 times, in fact, I think again occludes that there has not been a ceasefire. What we've seen merely is a slight slowing down. There's a continued denial of adequate food, fuel, and medical supplies. People in Gaza continue to face famine. And this is not, of course, even mentioning what is happening in the rest of historic Palestine, in the West Bank, with the ongoing violence by settlers supported by the Israeli police forces and military. Okay, so I want now to turn to something very concrete and for us to think together about Canadian complicity in this. When John mentioned the land acknowledgement at the beginning, when he did the land acknowledgement and talked about this paper I'd published, I really want to emphasize that it's the same state, because this law faculty, there's a lot of work that goes on in this faculty on Indigenous settler legal relations, on Indigenous law, etc. There's a lot of work that goes on in this faculty on the climate and issues of climate justice. But I think without seeing how it's the same state that has a colonial history here, that is absolutely complicit in what is happening in Palestine, again, occludes our view and really, prohibits us from really understanding politically and juridically what the state is up to. So for reference on Canada's mentioned several times in Francesca Albanese's most recent report, Gaza Genocide, a Collective Crime, which really focuses on the issue of complicity. In terms of Canadian state complicity, after the provisional measures rulings, Canada has been now in violation of their legal obligation to prevent genocide under international law. And as I'll talk about more in a moment, they are complicit in sending arms to Israel through a legal loophole. They have provided diplomatic cover and state support for Israel for, of course, years, but most definitely since October 2023, and they continue to do that. We could also talk about the conditions for state recognition that Carney's government has set out. The most absurd terms, which are hard even to utter, that Palestine would need to be a Zionist state were it to be recognized. It's hard to say that aloud because it's so absurd. And then, of course, the Canadian CIFA, the Canadian-Israel Free Trade Agreement, which was brought into effect in 2007, which enables illegal settlements in the West Bank to export goods to Canada for sale, among other things. I'm not going to go into the complicity of the corporate sector, but I refer you to Francesca Albanese's report. In terms of the charitable sector, that's another area of Canadian complicity. The Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East have been working on mapping organizations that have charitable status that are complicit in human rights abuses and apartheid in Palestine. So I refer you to their website, which has many resources on it. And then, of course, we can think about the university sector and the ongoing institutional faculty and student exchanges with Israeli universities that are intertwined with the Israeli military, as detailed by Maya Wind in her book, Towers of Ivory and Steel, and situated on stolen lands, engaging in forms of racial discrimination against Palestinian faculty and students. And I will note that our law faculty has a much celebrated faculty exchange with Hebrew U Faculty of Law. They have brought visitors throughout the last 2 years, despite some of us trying to collegially and constructively address the issue. Hebrew University is at least part of the campus, and dormitories are located on stolen land in East Jerusalem. And if we think about the ruling of the ICJ, which found Israel in violation of the prohibitions on racial apartheid, we really need to be pressing our university, pressing our faculties, pressing our departments for why it is that they can continue with these institutional affiliations. And that is not even to mention the forms of racial discrimination and harassment that faculty, such as Professor Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian, had to deal with at the Hebrew University Faculty of Law. So these issues have been raised repeatedly, but yet our universities, our faculties persist. Okay, so in the last 2 minutes, I just want to talk quickly about divestment in Bill C-233, something very concrete. When we have these gatherings, these meetings, I think it's important to think about, what do we do, right? What are we going to do now? And of course, most people in this room have been doing a lot over the last several years, sometimes decades. But in terms of what's happening in this moment, what can we do? So Canada acceded to the Arms Trade Treaty in 2019, and there were amendments to the Export and Import Permits Act in 2019, which basically created a series of loopholes that have become a giant. These are the words of MP Jenny Kwan, who is sponsoring a private member's bill to close the loopholes. So in her words, the 2019 amendments left open a gaping loophole, a loophole that has since become a giant and open backdoor for weapons, components, and explosives to flow freely from Canada to the United States and then onward to some of the most brutal conflicts in the world. And the US loophole is the heart of the problem. So when Canada adopted, or they acceded to the Arms Trade Treaty, they did not adopt Article 4 of that treaty, which requires each state party to establish and maintain a national control system to regulate the export of parts and components for conventional arms covered by Article 2.1 of the treaty. So that system is supposed to ensure that parts are not transferred if they would contribute to or undermine peace and security, or they would be used in violations of international law or human rights. So this would have required Canada to treat weapons, parts, and components with the same scrutiny as full weapons systems, which it doesn't. Canada also left out a few other articles of the treaty, which I won't go into the details of right now. But what these loopholes mean are that Canadian-made weapons, explosives, and parts can cross into the US completely unmonitored, with no transparency and no public record. Once they arrive in the US, these components are often integrated into larger weapon systems, including F-35 fighter jets, Apache helicopters, and heavy munitions that are then exported to Israel, along with Saudi Arabia, along with Sudan, where they have been used to devastate civilian populations. A recent report by, and I'm going to end here, by Arms Embargo Now uncovered that hundreds of shipments of Canadian military goods are directly contributing to atrocities abroad. So this is not indirect complicity, again, quoting Jenny Kwan, this is active participation in a deadly supply chain. So right now, this private member's bill, C-233, is before Parliament. It's really important that people contact your MPs, use the toolkit that is on the Arms Embargo Now website, write petitions, lobby, write op-eds, raise awareness, and I think if this were to pass, that would be a significant improvement on the status quo, wherein Canada has been absolutely complicit in the ongoing genocide in Palestine. So thank you, I'll leave it there.
So now we're going to go to the video. Maybe I'll let you set it up. This is Omar Barghouti.
You're going to come here.
Oh, okay. So Omar Barghouti has recorded this especially for this forum.
Back in 2009, I wrote that our South Africa moment was nearing. Despite the US-Israeli live-stream genocide against over 2 million Palestinians in the illegally occupied and besieged Gaza Strip, I now think this moment is nearer than ever because of the unprecedented, meaningful, impactful solidarity worldwide that is beginning to affect policy change towards isolating Israel's 77-year-old regime of settler colonialism and apartheid like never before. A few weeks ago, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, wanted by the ICC for war crimes and crimes against humanity, shockingly called for Israel to become a super Sparta, admitting for the first time Israel's unprecedented global isolation. Even US President Trump, in his recent speech before the Israeli parliament, warned Israel of its worldwide isolation, saying, quote, "It was getting to be a little nasty out there in the world, and ultimately the world wins. You can't beat the world," end of quote. This world is us. It's all of us who have collectively, persistently, and strategically campaigned to end Israel's genocide. The BDS movement has been the main engine behind this isolation, so there's no doubt that every boycott, every divestment, every pressure for lawful sanctions is already contributing to our liberation struggle. But what about the ceasefire, one may ask? As many have said, to Israel, a ceasefire means you cease, we fire. We realize that even a real ceasefire would only be the first, most important step to end the genocide in the illegally occupied Strip. Without massive pressure, this will constitute only a continuation of a less visible form of genocide that Israel and the US hope will provoke less regional and global outrage, less boycotts, less sanctions. The famine, the repercussions of the annihilation of Gaza will not end with a ceasefire. Neither will Israel's illegal occupation, apartheid, and denial of our refugees' rights. Only serious accountability and lawful sanctions will force the US-Israeli genocidal axis to respect the ceasefire and eventually end the siege and occupation. Blaming the patent depravity and unspeakable criminality of Israel's genocide on Netanyahu and his government alone would betray either selective amnesia or a prejudiced reading of the current reality. According to recent Israeli public opinion polls, 82% of Jewish Israelis support the ethnic cleansing of all Palestinians from Gaza, and 56% support even the forced expulsion of Palestinian citizens of present-day Israel. About 50% support the full extermination of Palestinians in Gaza. According to Orly Noy, the chairwoman of B'Tselem, Israel's largest human rights organization, quote, "Israel is unleashing a Holocaust in Gaza, and it cannot be dismissed as the will of the country's current fascist leaders alone." End of quote. Noy calls for a denazification process in Israeli society. Israel, enabled and emboldened by the shameless, boundless military, financial, political, and media complicity, mainly of its fellow settler colonies, the US, Canada, and Australia, but also the European Union and the UK, is trying to normalize the fundamentally abnormal and to numb our consciences with its relentless savagery. Israel has for decades committed what Israeli historian Ilan Pappé calls incremental genocide, but it has viewed the rise to power of its natural allies, far-right, fascist, and authoritarian forces in the West, India, and elsewhere, as providing the long-coveted opportunity to finally exterminate the indigenous Palestinian survivors of its ongoing Nakba. Eliminating the natives, after all, is a feature, not a bug, in settler colonial history, as indigenous communities in Canada, the US, and Australia know quite well. A growing international human rights consensus now recognizes Israel's unspeakable crimes in Gaza as genocide, with the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry and the International Association of Genocide Scholars being the latest. Aside from murdering tens of thousands of Palestinians and reducing Gaza's 4,000-year-old heritage to ash, Israel is simultaneously reducing the very tenets of international law to tatters, and it's entrenching a world of might makes right. At the core of Israel's total impunity lies the complicity of states, corporations, and institutions with its regime of oppression, and it's precisely this complicity that the BDS movement seeks to disrupt and eventually sever. The global majority today realizes that Israel's regime of oppression is a model for much of the world's authoritarian rulers. It's a partner of fascist parties in the West, most of whom are anti-Semitic to the core, and of far-right regimes and dictatorships globally. Israel sells its military security technologies and colonial doctrines as battle-tested, of course on the bodies of Palestinians, Lebanese, Yemenis, Syrians, and other Arabs. Aside from the widespread bribing, bullying, and extortion of elected officials, Israel has extensively deployed the export of its weaponized spyware, as well as its disinformation and election rigging services as diplomacy tools to gain influence in dozens of countries, south and north. Israel's ongoing genocide, according to UN human rights experts, has included, quote, domicide, herbicide, scholasticide, medicide, cultural genocide, and more recently, ecocide, end of quote. Its deliberate destruction of all Palestinian universities in Gaza and hundreds of schools has prompted the heads of 15 Palestinian universities to call for isolating Israeli universities worldwide. Despite the repression and in response to Palestinian calls, tens of thousands of academics now support the academic boycott of Israel, many through what we call the silent boycott. Many universities, mostly in Europe, but also Latin America, South Africa, are finally cutting ties with Israeli universities and companies that are complicit in Israeli crimes. Israel's scholasticide, a term coined by Karma Nabulsi, the prominent Palestinian scholar at Oxford, did not begin in October 23, however, but goes back to the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the Nakba. An Israeli researcher's dissertation, for instance, reveals that during and immediately after the Nakba, tens of thousands of books stolen from Palestinian homes, schools, and libraries in Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, Safad, and elsewhere were plundered and many of them destroyed by Zionist and later Israeli militias. In the first few weeks of the Palestinian Intifada, or popular uprising, 1987 to 1993, Israel shut down all Palestinian universities, some like Birzeit for several consecutive years, and then it closed all 1,194 Palestinian schools in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Next came kindergartens. Eventually, every educational institution in the occupied Palestinian territory was forcibly closed. This prompted Palestinians to build an illegal network of underground schools. Israel's scholasticide is inseparable from its epistemicide against Palestinians. Facing Israel's Western-enabled genocide and exercising our moral agency, we in the BDS movement have persistently channeled our grief and our rage and strategic energy to end the genocide. Dismantling and the underlying regime of settler colonialism and apartheid, and holding the perpetrators and their accomplices to account. Palestinians have no illusions, though, that justice will shine on us from the UN or the ICJ. We have international law and the ethical high ground on our side as an indigenous people resisting a depraved genocidal system of oppression to achieve our rights. Ethics and the law are necessary in any liberation struggle, but they're never sufficient. To resist and dismantle a system of oppression, the oppressed invariably need power as well. People power, effective solidarity power, grassroots power, intersectional coalition power, media power, cultural power, among others. When the Palestinian consensus calls for BDS worldwide, including against Israel's complicit academic institutions, we're not begging the world for charity. We're calling for meaningful solidarity. But before both, we're demanding an end to complicity, to do no harm. As the struggle that abolished apartheid in South Africa has shown, ending state, corporate, and institutional complicity in Israel's system of oppression, especially through the nonviolent tactics of BDS, is the most effective form of solidarity. Launched in 2005, the nonviolent BDS movement is led by the largest coalition in Palestinian society. It's inspired by the South African anti-apartheid struggle and the US civil rights movement, among others, but it's mainly rooted in a century of Palestinian popular resistance. BDS aims at ending Israel's regime of occupation and apartheid and upholding the right of Palestinian refugees to return and receive reparations. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the BDS movement categorically opposes all forms of racism, including anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, and anti-Jewish racism. BDS targets complicity, not identity. There's nothing Jewish about Israel's illegal occupation, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, apartheid, or genocide. Therefore, there's nothing anti-Jewish about striving to end these structures of oppression. Over the last 2 decades, the BDS movement has built a massive network supported by trade unions, farmers' coalitions, as well as racial, social, gender, and climate justice movements, together representing tens of millions. The movement's impact has grown exponentially. Solidarity is now more needed than ever, and it begins with ending complicity and pushing for serious accountability. All major Palestinian trade unions and almost the entirety of Palestinian civil society have appealed to international trade unions and the Solidarity movement saying, quote, "As a matter of life or death urgency, we call for forming broad coalitions and building towards powerful mass disruptions where feasible that are context-sensitive, peaceful, and strategic, targeting complicit entities and calling for ending complicity and imposing lawful sanctions," end of quote. BDS is fundamentally calling on all people of conscience and their institutions to fulfill their profound moral obligation to desist from complicity in Israel's regime of oppression. So what are the movement's priorities for campuses worldwide? 1. Peacefully disrupting business as usual with Israel and its complicit institutions and mobilizing pressure to cut academic ties with them. One strategy to consider is declaring conscientious objection to participating in Israel-related projects, as pioneered by academics at Uppsala University in Sweden in cooperation with PACB. 2. Striving to include a complicity acknowledgement and a land acknowledgement whenever a complicit Israeli institution is mentioned, whether for affiliation purposes or otherwise, in any international conference, activity, or association. You can read more about this in PACB's position vis-à-vis the International Sociological Association during its recent conference in Morocco. 3. Pressuring universities, academic associations, and other entities to divest from Israel bonds and from companies that are complicit in Israel's grave human rights violations, and excluding complicit companies from tenders and contracts. 4. Declaring unions, academic departments, or universities apartheid-free zones. 5. Pressuring universities to adopt ethical procurement policies and ethical investment policies that exclude companies implicated in grave human rights violations anywhere, Sudan, Congo, Myanmar, Palestine, anywhere. 6. Pressuring governments to end their shameful complicity, starting with imposing a comprehensive military embargo and other financial, economic, academic, diplomatic sanctions, including expelling Israel from the UN, the Olympics, FIFA, and so on. 7, and last, supporting legal and human rights groups' initiatives for investigating and prosecuting Israelis and others who have been involved in international crimes against Palestinians. But some of us are having genocide fatigue and see no hope, some have said. Well, Palestinians do not have the luxury of genocide fatigue or of giving up hope. Also, as British Pakistani writer Nadim Aslam says, quote, "Despair has to be earned. I personally have not done all I can to change things. I haven't yet earned the right to despair," end of quote. For a century, the Palestinian people has resisted colonial oppression without ever giving up. We insist on our full menu of rights, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu once put it. Never give in to despair. Never give up hope. You haven't earned it yet. We're counting on your unwavering solidarity in our pursuit of our South Africa moment. Thank you.